One of the most beautiful gifts that life can offer. And that is the gift of having a dilemma. And I want to explore this notion or experience of having a dilemma in the company of an old teacher, Zhang Yan, a teacher who features in the Wu Men Quan, a collection of great koans that we study in our tradition. And I want to begin by looking at the story of Zhang Yan, the way he came to appreciate the depths and liberating qualities of a dilemma. It's said that when Zhang Yan began his Zen studies, he was very young. But he was recognized even at that early age as being unusually bright, a very intelligent and quick-witted boy. And he began his training under the great teacher Bai Zhang. Many people will be familiar with that name. Bai Zhang of the wonderful fox fame. However, despite Zhang Yan's great intelligence and rapidly growing learning in the way, he could not penetrate Bai Zhang's Dharma. And we're told this was true even at the point of Bai Zhang's death. Bai Zhang died and left the young Zhang Yan without his teacher and without having penetrated the way. But luckily for Zhang Yan, Bai Zhang had another student, Guishan, also a wonderful teacher in our tradition, who was teaching in another temple. So Zhang Yan made the journey to resume his study under Guishan. And of course, Guishan was very interested in this. A young monk from my old teacher's monastery. I must go and speak with him. And he did. He met up with Zhang Yan and said, I hear you've traveled all the way from my late teacher's monastery. And I'm told that you are very bright, very intelligent young man. And perhaps you even have some insight into the Dharma. So let me ask you, what can you say about your true self before even your parents were born? Well, Zhang Yan was flummoxed. He was struck dumb by this question. And being intellectually minded, he raced off to his room to check through all his notes and all the books. He probably went to the library too to check through all of the sutras and sastras and guttas and everything. If he was alive now, he would be busily typing into Google, what is my true self before even my parents were born? But to no avail. Devastated, he went back to Guishan, his new teacher, and said, I failed. I cannot respond to you. Please tell me. Please tell me what is my true self before even my parents were born. But Guishan, being the wonderful teacher that he was, answered this way. He said, I have nothing to teach you. And if I tried to express something, later you would revile me. Besides, whatever understanding I have is my own and will never be yours. So, Zhang Yan has a dilemma. And in the thick of this dilemma, he decided that his notes and all his learning were worthless. And so he burned them. He burned everything that he had so carefully written down and recorded and preserved. And he vowed that he would become what was called a rice gruel monk, a monk who would just perform the menial tasks in the kitchen. Certainly not a monk of any notable rank. And he did this, having destroyed his notes, so that he could take up this question of Guishan's personally, moment to moment, living into it deeply, not theoretically, but taking it on as his own living dilemma, his own vital question. He soon heard, probably from the gossip in the kitchen, that there was an old tomb of an ancestral teacher nearby that was being left unattended. And he thought, fantastic, this is even more lowly than the kitchen. I can go and look after this place where no one else is even around. And he asked Guishan for permission and was granted it. And he went to this remote ancestral tomb. And he built a little hut nearby, and he became the caretaker, the groundsman, looking after the paths, sweeping the paths, tending to the grave, looking after a very tender place of life and death, all the while keeping this question very much alive in his heart. And it was here on one of his days, sweeping the ground, sweeping the fallen leaves, that he happened to sweep a small little stone that was on the path. And the broom flicked it as brooms do, and it shot off through the air and struck a little stand of bamboo, where it made this tiny noise, tock. And with that tock, all of Zhang Yan's doubts, questions, hesitations, confusions dissolved. And he was so moved by this, so radiantly awake in the wake of this talk, that he turned in the direction of his teacher, Guishan, and said, thank goodness you never tried to tell me. If you had tried to explain anything to me, I would not be experiencing this joy right now. And in gratitude, he then sped off back to the temple of Guishan and wrote Guishan a poem, a rather traditional way of presenting your realization to a teacher. And I'll read you the poem because it is a marvelous expression of the resolution of this dilemma through just an incredible little talk. Here's the poem. One talk has made me forget all my previous knowledge. No artificial discipline is needed at all. In every moment I uphold the ancient way and never fall into the rut of mere quietism. Wherever I walk, no traces are left, and my senses are not fettered by rules of conduct. Everywhere, those who have found this truth all declare it to be of the highest order. We're told that Kynan, reading this poem, simply nodded and smiled and said, "Ah, this one's gone through." So how interesting that this was made possible for Zhang Yan because he refused to settle on an intellectual answer. And in fact, his teacher refused to give him an intellectual answer. I was amused to read the other day a little aphorism, actually, from the great Spanish poet Juan Ramón Jiménez, who has this lovely thing to say. He says, "There is a place within us that can be reached by intelligence, but there is a deeper place that only the spirit can get to. And that is why those who are merely completely intelligent in science or art, verse or prose, always seem like spies." I think this is a fabulous way of describing it, the way the intellectual mind can only spy on life. But you cannot spy on Zen. You cannot sneak up on it or observe it through binoculars from a distance. Zen must be realized personally. And it's so interesting that the energy of realizing the way personally comes in the form of deep inquiry, great doubt. It comes from absorbing and becoming your dilemma entirely. And it's also very interesting that, as I mentioned at the outset, Zhang Yan himself became a great teacher. And the most famous example of his teaching is in the Wu Min Quan, case 5 of the Wu Min Quan. And I'll give you this case now because I think it's a beautiful example of how this teacher's ability to stay with difficulty opened the way entirely for him, and that this is the teaching he offers not only to his students then, but to us in the particular world that we are in right now. Here's the case. It's called Up a Tree. Zhang Yan says, "It is as though you were up in a tree, hanging from a branch with your teeth. Your hands and feet can't touch any branch. Someone appears beneath the tree and asks, 'What is the meaning of Bodhidharma coming from the West?' Which is another way of saying, what is the meaning of Zen? What is the point of Zen?" And Zhang Yan continues, "If you do not answer, you neglect your responsibility. If you do answer, you lose your life. What do you do?" So the trick with this, as with any great koan, is to put yourself in exactly the situation that is being described. You're up a tree. You're hanging onto the branch with your teeth. Your arms and feet can't reach anything, can't grab hold of anything, are just flailing around. And then, to make matters even worse, somebody arrives beneath the tree and asks you, what is the meaning of Zen? There's a lot that we can look into here, but I want you to feel initially the dilemma and feel it physically, just as all the other dilemmas in your life must be experienced physically. What do you do? Now, it's interesting for me that whenever we do cling to something, whatever we cling to it with becomes useless for anything else. If we pick up a ball, for instance, with our left hand, we can't use that hand to play the piano. Just as if we pick up a certain idea with our minds, we cannot use our minds for any other idea. In this case, the monk is holding onto the branch with his teeth, which makes it impossible for him to talk. He's rendered mute. And yet there is this call from beneath the tree. Do you recognize this kind of call in your own life? What is the meaning of Zen? And maybe simply that your partner might have asked you that question. It may be that work colleagues have, or your children have. In fact, I would say that a whole generation of children are asking us this question right now. Just as the charcoal forests up and down the east coast and on Kangaroo Island are asking us this question right now. Just as coronavirus is asking us this question right now. What is the meaning of practice right now? So let's not lose sight of the great calling that is happening all the time, to us, for us, as us. These are the cries of the world, and we must ask ourselves, how can we respond? How do we respond? And what does it mean here to say, if you respond, you lose your life? Clearly the images of opening your mouth, losing your grip and falling from the tree. But are we losing our life or losing the life we think we have? And what kind of a life are we leading if we cannot respond to these cries of the world? The great power and energy of this koan is to realize that when we are in this dilemma, there is no obvious escape. And yet our freedom lies exactly there. Juan Ramon Jimenez again has something interesting, and again from his aphorisms, which I've been enjoying recently. He says this, which I think is interesting, and in relation to this case, he says, so let us realize that here we have everything. That here we will come to an end and be indefinitely reborn. And let us, the living and the dead, feel immense affection for this poor round world of ours. Our father, son, daughter, brother, lover. I love that he brings in this deeply heartfelt sense of affection for the world. the affection for the cries of the world. Is that not where we are right now? Even as we cling on to whatever version of life is familiar or simply available? How can we embody and realize and honor the deep affection for the world that we have? Well, I would say that if your mouth fills with a response to the cries of the world, then of course you will be crying with them. And you will fall not into the rut of quietism, which was in that verse of Zhang Yan's. Remember, he says he does not fall into the rut of quietism. Instead, you will be able to fall into the arms of the one who calls. Your true self before even your parents were born. Or perhaps we could say in a more homely way, as one Ramon Jimenez does, into the arms of the world. Our father, son, daughter, brother, lover. So perhaps in the discussion period that follows, we can look into the question of dilemma and how we embody it, and what it's like for you right now, personally, in the world with all of its extraordinary change and challenge right now. The world is charging us with the responsibility to respond. What do you do?